One of the real tragedies of filming on a crappy phone camera is that it makes every single lipstick I wear just look hot pink. This is not hot pink. This is a beautiful dark berry shade that you sadly can't see. Let's just hold a moment of silence for the lost potential of this lipstick. Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about my recent favourite classics. So this video is going to be a list of classics that I have recently read and loved, but that didn't qualify for my all-time favourite classics list. The all-time favourites classics video is going to be linked up here. In that one I talked about classics that I have loved for a long time. So that meant that the books on that list are all books that I have read more than once. However, the books on this list are books that I haven't read more than once, books that I've recently discovered over the past, say, 1 or 2 years. Before I get into the list, I just want to reiterate my personal definition of a classic, which is a classic is any book that was written or published before 1960. It doesn't matter whether that book was popular. It doesn't matter whether that book frequently shows up in the 100 books you need to read before you die list. The only criterion a book has to fulfill in order to be considered a classic by me is that it has to be from before 1960. What's interesting about this list of my recent favourite classics is that most of them, in fact 6 out of 9, are 20th century classics. I feel like my all-time favourite classics list was a lot more skewed towards the 19th century. So maybe that means that I am expanding my reading horizons into the first half of the 20th century. Who knows? Also, I couldn't think of a really good way of ordering this list, so here they are in chronological order, because that clearly makes the most sense. The first book on my list is Persuasion by Jane Austen. This one is technically a reread because I did read it once several years ago, but since I remembered barely anything about this story, I decided to count it as a new read. This is one that I discovered in the context of my 1818 novel project, so this one was published in 1818, and it is the story of a young woman called Anne Elliot who has some very awkward encounters with an ex. I did a full review of this book as well, so that will be linked up here and you can have a look at that if you want a more detailed review of this book. But really, the reason why it's on this list is because it encapsulates the best of Jane Austen's writing for me. It's got a really fascinating main character that you can identify with, but who's not a bland kind of stand-in for a person, but who has a real personality. And the love story is very unusual because, like I said, Anne Elliot develops feelings for a man who she turned down almost a decade before this book is set. So that's a very interesting setup. The story is also mostly set in Bath. We get a little bit more of that kind of town life that we don't usually read about in Jane Austen books. Most of them are set in the countryside, in little villages, whereas this book is partly set in the countryside, especially the first half, and then in the second half we get to see this beautiful town of Bath through Jane Austen's eyes. The next book, also from 1818, is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book follows a young Swiss man called Dr. Frankenstein who manages to create life without getting pregnant and then regrets that almost instantly. I think the basic setup of this story is so well known that when you read it, the differences between what you expect the story to be and what the story actually is are the most striking. Frankenstein is a really short book, and I found it one of the most accessible 19th century classics that I've ever read. The style flows so easily, with a caveat that you have to push through the first 2 or 3 chapters first. If you haven't picked Frankenstein up yet, don't be intimidated by those first chapters. Just push through them and you will enjoy a really fun but also creepy and interesting adventure, which plays out slightly differently to what you might expect. Again, for this book, because I read it for the 1818 novel project, there is a separate review of that find that up here. The next book on my list, and the most recent discovery, is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This one I read for Victober this year, and it was the highlight of my month. In short, this is the story of a mysterious stranger arriving in the neighbourhood with a very interesting backstory. And again, this is a framed narrative. They really liked those in the 19th century. Oh, by the way, this book is from 1848. So between the first two and the third entries on my list here, we have jumped 30 years. Yeah, this is another framed narrative where the beginning and the end are told from the perspective of a man called... I genuinely forget his name every time I want to talk about him. Gilbert Markham. And he is one of the villagers in this little tight-knit kind of community somewhere in rural England when a mysterious widow called Mrs. Graham moves into an old manor house. And she clearly has some sort of secret because she is a bit strange, she isn't very social, she doesn't really open up very easily. And then a lot of gossip developed around her and about her, about what might be wrong with that woman. And I was going to say this being the 19th century, but actually that sort of thing happens today. Her being a single woman who doesn't open up about her past obviously creates a lot of talk about, you know, her being sexually deviant, which in the 19th century could mean quite a lot. And then Markham finds out about her past through her own diaries. So the majority of the book is actually her diaries from years before she moved to that village. And that is the really interesting part of the book. We hear about her failed marriage with a very abusive man, and that relationship is written about in such a beautiful manner that it just drew me in so much. It's one of the most heartfelt 19th century classics that I've ever read, because classics from that time are often a little bit distant. Like there's a space between the book and the reader. You know, you read the stories out of a sense of curiosity. There's often not a very deep emotional connection between you and the characters in the book. But The Tenant of Wildfell Hall read so modern in that regard. I almost can't believe it is from 1848. It almost reads like a historical novel, like a book that is written today with today's sensibilities and today's politics about 1848. And I loved that so much. This is the first Anne Bronte book that I have read, and I possibly love this more than Jane Eyre. This was an absolutely outstanding read. I gave it 5 stars and I recommend you read it. Next up, we jump into the 20th century with A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. When I read this, I didn't really have any expectations of it. I read it because I knew that it was set in a boarding school, and I love boarding school novels. But this little book delivers a really beautiful story. It's set in this slightly dodgy boarding school for rich girls, and the main character, Sarah, is one of the students there. Until partway through the book, misfortune befalls her, and she has to get used to a radically different life to what she has led before. This is just gorgeously written. It uses some kind of tropes and characters and stories that we're familiar with, especially from Victorian literature. But it is an all-round charming, beautiful book with some gorgeous messages that I wish I had read when I was a child myself. But I definitely enjoy it as an adult as well, so I recommend you read that if you have an interest in boarding school novels like I do. If you have an interest in, let's say, sort of Cinderella type stories, although this one's more of a reverse Cinderella type story. I feel like this is a beautiful book to read now in the winter time, maybe around Christmas. And if you haven't read it yet, then do. It's also very easy to read. It is written in a very open and honest and frank style. Next up, one of my 5-star reads of this year, and it is Howard's End by E.M. Forster. This book is from 1910. This is the 3rd E.M. Forster I've read. Morris, which was the first one I read, made it onto my all-time favourite classics list. The second one I read was A Room with a View, which was very beautiful, but didn't draw me in quite enough to make it on to this list. But this one is amazing. This follows 2 rich sisters from London who we'd today call Bohemian, and their sort of encounters with 2 other families. This sounds really dull when I just summarize it like that, but the true beauty of Forster's writing is in the characters and their fears and hopes about their lives. This is a very slow-moving book. In a way, it feels more like, say, a soap opera, in that it is very sentimental and very episodic, and there isn't really a single line of plot that moves you through the book. Instead, what moves you through the book is the absolutely gorgeous writing and the portrayal of society as a whole. This is from a time that I find very interesting to read about, and that is, the pre-World War I 20th century. And we get this sense of a kind of freedom that comes with financial stability and wealth, which most of the characters in this book enjoy. And then that is contrasted with images we get of people who have to work harder to survive and to thrive. And all of these lives are interwoven in a very beautiful way. I just found it the most gorgeous book to read during the summer. It's definitely a summer book, but don't let that put you off. Reading Forster gives me the same fuzzy feelings that I get from reading Jane Austen. So if you enjoy Jane Austen's writing, I would recommend that you pick up an E.M. Forster, preferably Howard's End, because it's got the same kind of vibe set forward 100 years from Jane Austen's time. Next up, we have the one book that has BookTube made me read it all over it, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. We've now jumped to 1938 in our chronology. If you want to know exactly how I felt reading Rebecca, then check out another video linked up here, which is me reacting to Rebecca after every single chapter of reading it. This is the story of a young, newly married woman who lives in an old English country house with her new husband. Her life there is overshadowed and almost haunted by the memory of her predecessor who died, and that predecessor is Rebecca. Yeah, this is a #mood, like 97% atmosphere. If you like an atmospheric, ghostly, dark, creepy sort of a story, then this is for you. The story itself, like I said, there's the big question about Rebecca. Who was she? What was she like? What are the circumstances of her death? What was her relationship with the new husband of the main character? When I say mystery, I'm not talking about a crime mystery, a problem that has to be solved. It's not that kind of mystery. It's more about trying to see through the fog of other people's perceptions of this woman, Rebecca, and then getting to what she was like and who she was and why that matters. At the same time, this is the story of a really messed up relationship. So if all of this speaks to you and you haven't, for whatever reason, you haven't read it yet, even though here you are watching a BookTube video, then I recommend picking this up. The prose is as beautiful as everyone says it is. Next up, my one outstanding read of last year, and it is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. Reading this book made me so happy. This was when I was still trying to figure out what sort of books I like. Turns out it is that. Yeah, that is the sort of book I like. This is written in diary form, and it is the diary of a 17-year-old girl who lives in an old castle with her very eccentric family. This book is from 1948, but it is set in the 1930s, pre-World War II. This is funny and heartwarming. It is like a pre-young adult novel, as in if this was published today it would be marketed as a young adult book, and it is one of the best examples of a diary novel that I have ever read. The main character, Cassandra, is witty and descriptive, and she's trying to in her diary portray what's happening with her family, you know, her grumpy author father who hasn't written a book in ages, his bohemian hippie wife, her older sister who is struggling with the poverty that the family is in. It's a very middle class sort of a book, but I love it for that. This is a really good classic to begin with if you are not into classics but you are into YA, especially if you are into contemporary YA. There's a bit of romance, there's a bit of tragedy, there's a bit of comedy. It has everything that a good contemporary YA novel has, except it's from the 40s. This, again, was a 5-star read for me, and I can't wait to reread it. I think I'm going to wait until spring, because this very much feels like a springtime novel. Next up, and we are now moving into the 50s, is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham from 1951. This follows a scientist called Bill, who's one of the few people who kept their eyesight after the whole world suddenly goes blind overnight. At the same time as humanity is struggling with that crisis, there's also this breed of mobile plants that are suddenly starting to make a move on the humans. And the combined threats of everyone losing their eyesight and of those killer plants suddenly starting to basically hunt down people makes for a very unusual dystopian setting. This is a perfect example of what I love in a dystopian novel, which is, very specifically, I like it when the dystopic, is that even a word? When the event has only just happened. The story starts on the day that everyone has gone blind, and it follows the main character over the next few months and then later years as well, as society starts to adapt to this change. And this book does that with a lot of humour and a lot of adventure and some very interesting characters. What I would say the female lead of this is a really interesting character. She's a woman who has made a name for writing a very sexy book, you know, in the 1940s or early 50s. She is fighting for survival alongside Bill, and that couple I found very interesting and very lovely to read about. Yeah, this just has everything I like in a dystopian novel. It's got the kind of near future setting, it's got a bit of romance, a bit of adventure, a bit of gore, you know, a bit of violence, and there's a real threat to the humans, and there's a real sense of human ingenuity in survival that I enjoy. And then the final book on the list from 1955 is The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. I read this book after watching the film from the 90s, but the book does play out a little bit differently, so I would recommend reading the book if you enjoyed the film. This is a psychological thriller about a very charming and very dangerous man and his adventures involving identity theft, murder, and a whole lot of sexual frustration. The main character in this, Tom Ripley, is a young American. Hello, can you not eat my microphone or my lipstick? Anyway, he's this con man who manages to worm his way into a group of people in Italy. Specifically, he is trying to persuade a very wealthy young American called Dickie Greenleaf to leave Italy, where he's set up, and move back to his family. But that turns very dark very quickly, and I don't know how to talk about this book without spoiling the entire plot. The reason I like it is probably because it is so absurd and also very slow moving, and because we see the whole story from the perspective of a true psychopath. Tom Ripley is, I want to say, an anti-hero, but he's not. He's just the villain, you know. He's just a crazy killer, horrible person, criminal, with some serious problems. And yet you kind of want him to succeed, and that just messes with your head. This is another one of those really accessible classics that I can recommend to people who love thrillers but maybe haven't read a mid-century thriller before. This is mostly set in Italy, which I also enjoyed. It's got a weird holiday vibe to it, again, which is very clashing with the whole murder and identity theft plot. This is just a fun psychological thriller, if you like that sort of thing. I didn't think that it is my sort of thing, but I really did enjoy this one, and I am definitely going to reread it at some point, because I feel like there is so much in this book that I still kind of missed out on. Because even though it's a slow-moving book, it is at the same time a bit of a page-turner, because you get so sucked into the twisted mind of the main character that you just want to see where this journey is going. And I can tell you, it's going nowhere good. And this was my list of my recently discovered classic favourites. I love that I keep finding classics that I really like, and I feel so comfortable in the time periods of the 19th and early to mid 20th century that I just can't wait to discover more and more of these books. So I'm sure there will be an update on this video at some point, maybe in the next year, about more recent favourite classics. But for now I want to know if there are any classics that you would recommend to me based on this list. I think if you've watched this list and if you've watched my all-time favourite classics video, then you have a pretty good idea of my taste in classics. And I'm always on the lookout for more recommendations. Have you read any of the books that I listed in this, and do you agree with my assessment of them, or did you absolutely hate those books? Thank you for watching. Bye!